The rain lashed against the tall windows of the mansion, streaking the glass with silver lines that blurred the world outside. Inside, silence weighed heavier than the storm. The billionaire sat alone in his study, his hands gripping the edges of his desk, his face buried in shadows. For all his wealth, for all the empires he had built, he carried a wound no money could heal. His only son had not spoken a word in years. The boy's silence was a constant reminder of everything he could not control, a punishment for all the mistakes he could not undo. Down the long hallway, the boy sat quietly on the floor of his playroom, crayons scattered around him. He did not hum, did not laugh, did not call out for anyone. His small lips trembled at times as if words were trapped inside, fighting to come out, but they never did. The mansion, filled with staff and luxury, was a prison of quiet despair, where footsteps echoed louder than voices. That evening, a new figure entered through the grand iron gates. She came in soaked from the storm, her modest dress clinging to her frame, her eyes lowered as though afraid to meet the grandeur of the house. She had been hired quickly, almost carelessly, a maid to tend to the endless halls and rooms most people never touched. To the staff, she was nothing unusual, just another pair of hands for cleaning. But she carried with her a secret heavier than the bag she clutched. She was not simply a maid. She was once a doctor, a healer of children, a woman who had dedicated her life to restoring broken voices and fragile hearts. Until tragedy struck and a single mistake had shattered her career, stripping her of her title, her reputation, and her will. She had sworn never to practice again. Yet here she was, disguised in humility, stepping into the very house where her purpose would be tested once more. Her first glimpse of the boy shook her. His eyes were wide pools of sadness, his tiny hands gripping a crayon so tightly it snapped in two. He did not look at her, did not acknowledge her presence. But she noticed everything. The way his chest rose in shallow breaths, the way he stared at his drawings as if they were the only language he could use, the way his silence screamed louder than words. Something inside her stirred. A memory of children she had once healed, of voices she had once unlocked. She felt her heart ache with a pain she thought she had buried forever. Later that night, as she passed the playroom again, she saw him sitting in the dark, the broken crayon still in his hand. She knelt quietly beside him, picked up another crayon, and began to draw on the paper. Slowly, without a word, he glanced at her. His hand hesitated, then offered her a different color. It was a small gesture, but in that moment something unspoken passed between them, a fragile bridge across the silence. She whispered softly, her voice trembling, "I hear you. Even in your silence, I hear you." For the first time in years, the boy's eyes did not look away. The following days unfolded like cautious steps on thin ice. The boy did not speak, but his silence began to shift in subtle ways. When the maid entered a room, his eyes followed her. When she picked up a crayon, he would slide another toward her hand. And once, when she hummed a lullaby under her breath, he pressed his ear closer, his small body trembling as though clinging to a sound that promised safety. The staff whispered among themselves, curious but wary. None of them had ever managed to coax the boy from his quiet shell, yet this new maid, timid and soft-spoken, seemed to carry a strange influence over him. They reported it to the Billionaire, who dismissed their chatter at first. But curiosity gnawed at him, and one evening, as he stood in the doorway of the playroom, he saw it with his own eyes. The boy sat cross-legged on the floor, scribbling shapes on paper while the maid knelt beside him. She guided his hand gently, tracing letters with him. She did not push him to speak, only whispered the sounds so quietly that they seemed like secrets floating in the air. His small lips moved as if mimicking, but no sound came. Still, the effort was there. The billionaire's heart clenched painfully at the sight. He had paid fortunes to doctors and specialists, begged the most brilliant minds in the world to help, and none had reached his son like this stranger disguised in plain clothes. That night, over dinner, he studied her with sharper eyes. She moved carefully, never drawing attention to herself, never speaking unless spoken to. Yet there was a grace in the way she carried herself, a depth in her gaze when she looked at his son. Something about her didn't belong to the world of servants. She was too careful, too knowledgeable, too much like someone hiding a truth. The next afternoon, a storm rolled in, thunder shaking the mansion. The boy froze, dropping his crayons, his hands flying to his ears as tears welled in his eyes. He trembled violently, retreating into the corner like a trapped bird. Panic surged in the billionaire as he rushed forward, but before he could reach, the maid was already there. She knelt and gathered the boy into her arms, whispering steadily, her voice wrapping around him like a shield. "You're safe. I'm here. Nothing will hurt you," the boy whimpered, a fragile sound that sliced through the storm louder than thunder. Both the maid and the billionaire froze. The boy had made a sound. His lips quivered again as if testing the waters of a world he had long been denied. It was only a faint cry, a broken note, but it was enough to shake the air with possibility. The billionaire's chest tightened, his throat burning with unshed tears. His son had made a sound in her arms, not his. His voice, however fragile, had been drawn out by her. The storm outside raged on, but inside a different storm was brewing in his heart. A storm of suspicion, jealousy, and a desperate, unspoken hope. That night, he waited in the shadows of the hallway until she passed by, her steps weary. His voice was low, sharp. "You're not just a maid, are you?" Her breath caught, her eyes widening as the secret she had buried threatened to surface. Her hands tightened around the tray she was carrying, the silverware rattling softly. For a moment, the silence between them was heavier than the mansion's walls. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. There was no escape in them, only resignation. I'm just here to help," she whispered, her voice trembling. But the billionaire stepped closer, his gaze sharp and unrelenting. "You're not a maid," he said again, his tone more accusation than question. No maid knows how to hold him like that. No maid whispers sounds he hasn't heard in years. "Who are you?" Her heart pounded. Every instinct screamed at her to lie, to protect herself, to keep her secret buried. But then, behind him, she saw the boy peeking from the hallway, his wide, fragile eyes watching them both. She could not betray his fragile trust. Taking a deep breath, she lowered her voice. "I was a doctor, a specialist for children like him, but I lost everything. My license, my career, my life." The billionaire's breath hitched, his fists clenched, torn between fury and disbelief. "You deceived me. You walked into my home under false pretenses." "I walked in because I needed work," she said, her voice breaking. "But I stayed because of him. I couldn't turn away when I saw his pain. You've hired the best, I know. But sometimes it's not just about medicine. It's about being heard, being held, being seen. That boy has been trapped in silence for too long, and I can help him. If you'll let me." The weight of her words lingered in the air. The billionaire turned his back, pacing the hallway with restless energy. He had every reason to throw her out, to protect his son from more disappointment, from false hope. And yet, something inside him whispered otherwise. He had seen the way his son looked at her, the way his small hands reached for her as though she were the only anchor in a storm. The boy stepped forward timidly, clutching the broken crayon he always carried like a shield. He walked past his father and stopped in front of the maid doctor. His lips parted, trembling. No words came, but his eyes shone with a plea clearer than any language. He wanted her to stay. The billionaire froze. His son had never approached anyone like this. Not even him. A lump formed in his throat, the ground shifting beneath his pride and anger. At last he sighed, his voice low and ragged. "If you stay, if you continue, and if you fail him, I will never forgive you." She nodded, her eyes moist but unwavering. "I won't fail him." That night, she sat with the boy in the dim glow of a bedside lamp. She sang to him softly, her hand resting gently on his. He didn't speak, but he hummed faintly along with the melody, as if the first cracks in his silence had begun to break. And outside the door, unseen, the billionaire leaned against the wall, listening, his face buried in his hands. For the first time in years, tears streamed down his cheeks, not of despair, but of hope he was too afraid to claim. Days turned into weeks, and the mansion began to breathe in a rhythm it hadn't known for years. Laughter had not yet filled the halls, but there was a softness now, a quiet hum of possibility. The boy followed her everywhere, clinging to her presence as if it anchored him to life. With patience carved from sorrow, she taught him, not with pressure or commands, but with whispers and play. She drew pictures and let him mimic the shapes with his lips. She sang songs, letting him hum the parts he dared. Every tiny effort was a victory. The billionaire watched silently from the edges. At first, suspicion shadowed his every glance, but slowly, those shadows began to thin. He could not deny the changes. His son looked him in the eye now, even if briefly. His small fingers no longer trembled constantly. The silence that had once felt like a curse was now filled with unspoken hope. Still, the billionaire's pride made it hard to admit the truth. He had relied on power and money all his life, and yet this maid, this fallen doctor, was succeeding where his fortune had failed. One late evening, as the boy sat on the carpet with blocks stacked high, she knelt beside him. "Do you know," she whispered gently, "that your voice is inside you, waiting? You don't have to be afraid of it. It's yours. And when you're ready, I'll be here to hear it." The boy blinked up at her, his lips quivering as if he wanted to respond. Then, for the first time, a sound escaped. Not a whimper, not a cry, but a faint syllable. It was broken, fragile, but unmistakable. Her eyes widened, tears springing instantly. She clasped his small hand, whispering encouragement. "Yes, that's it. Again, my brave boy. Again." He tried, the effort straining his little face. Another syllable, still fractured, followed. She laughed through her tears, pulling him into her arms. The billionaire, who had been passing by, froze in the doorway. His heart slammed against his ribs, his knees nearly buckling. The sound, the sweet, broken sound, was his son's attempt at a word. His vision blurred as he stumbled forward. The boy looked up at him startled, but instead of retreating, he held out his crayon as if to share his small triumph. The billionaire dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as they cupped his son's tiny face. You tried," he whispered, his own voice cracking. "You spoke." His son blinked at him, silent again, but in his gaze shone something that tore the billionaire apart. Trust. A fragile, newfound trust. Later that night, unable to sleep, the billionaire found the maid doctor sitting quietly in the garden. The moonlight framed her face, weary but radiant. He stood in silence for a long moment before speaking. "You've done what no one else could. You gave him back more than a voice. You gave him life." She lowered her eyes, her voice soft. He gave it to himself. I only showed him the way, but deep down, they both knew it was more than that. The mansion felt different now. Light poured through its windows, and even the staff walked with softened steps, as if afraid to disturb the fragile miracle unfolding inside. The boy was changing, still quiet, still hesitant, but no longer lost. Every day he uttered broken syllables, each one stronger than the last. They were not full words yet, but each attempt struck like lightning through the heart of his father, who listened as though he were hearing the sound of creation itself. The maid doctor kept her promise with tireless devotion. She sat with the boy for hours, guiding him with patience that no amount of training could teach. She celebrated his smallest triumphs as if they were victories greater than kingdoms, and in the process she healed not just a child, but a father too. A man who had believed himself cursed to a life where money could not touch the one thing he needed most: his son's voice. One evening, as the sun set in crimson light, the boy sat between them. The billionaire had returned early from business, drawn more and more to the quiet sanctuary his son and the woman created together. The boy held both their hands, his small fingers gripping tightly. He looked from one face to the other, his lips parting. For a moment, silence filled the air. Then, with a trembling effort, he forced a word out. It was broken, imperfect, but clear enough to freeze them both in place. "Fa." "There." The billionaire's breath shattered into sobs. He pulled his son into his arms, holding him as tears streamed down his face uncontrollably. "Say it again," he begged, his voice breaking. "Please, say it again." The boy buried his head against his chest, whispering the fractured sound once more. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it belonged to him. The billionaire wept openly, clutching his son as though he would never let go. For years he had lived in silence, and now, in the span of a single word, His entire world had been restored. He looked up at the woman who had given them this miracle. She stood silently, her own tears glistening in the fading light. She had meant to stay hidden, to live unnoticed, but now the truth of her presence was undeniable. She was no maid, she was the angel who had carried his son out of darkness. The billionaire rose, his son still clinging to him, and stepped toward her. His voice trembled, stripped of pride and filled with gratitude. "You saved him. You saved us both. I don't care about the past, about what the world thinks of you. You're not just a maid. You're the only one who gave me my son back." She lowered her head, overwhelmed, but he reached for her hand, steady and firm. For the first time, she did not feel like a fallen doctor or a servant in disguise. She felt like someone who had finally found her place. In that moment, surrounded by the echoes of a child's first words, the mansion was no longer haunted by silence. It was alive again, with hope, with love, with a voice that had finally returned.